Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the Radical Exchange live stream. Super happy to be here today, and a big thanks to our guests, Nathan Schneider, Deepti Doshi, and Divya Siddarth. Thank you so much for joining us. We're, as usual, just going to do a very sort of informal conversation, share some thoughts, do a little bit of, give ourselves permission to do a little bit of thinking in public. And the sort of topic that I'd like to kind of talk about a bit today, and I'll give us some food for thought and some prompts in a minute, is the idea of progress. So I've been thinking a lot about sort of progress in governance specifically. So what does it mean for governance to get better? And is it sort of a category error to compare that to the way that technology, quote unquote, progresses or not? And but why don't we start with some quick introductions? So you know me, my name's Matt Prewitt, president of RadicalxChange Foundation. Let's just go around and say a few words about who we are and what we do and what we're thinking about. Starting with Divya.
I'm Divya, political economist at Microsoft, researcher in residence at RadicalxChange, part of a bunch of different, I guess, organizations and spaces in the tech governance general area, co-steward at Versus. And what I've been thinking about recently, and Matt knows this, is the concept of collective intelligence. Like, what does it mean for us to have governance systems that really, one, have a focus that is inherently collective, and then two, take advantage of that collective to incorporate many different perspectives and points of view, and then have mechanisms to get that somewhere, right? To lead to, well, maybe it's progress. That's not the word I would typically use, but to lead to better outcomes that are shared. So that's top of mind for me.
Thanks, Divya. And Deepti.
Hey, everybody. I'm Deepti. I co-lead a little product studio called New Public with Eli Pariser, where we're really exploring the idea of digital public spaces and what it would mean to be building kind of like that public infrastructure of our digital lives. I'm really thinking both about the design constructs that are required in order for these digital spaces to be spaces that are building cohesion and plurality in the world, and also the labor that's required in order to make that happen. And so it's not just, the design and the prototypes it is that we build, but there's also that same investment and cultivation required in, this like often unseen labor that is behind the safety and the flourishing of these spaces.
Super. Thanks for joining us. And Nathan.
Hi, I'm Nathan Schneider, and I'm an assistant professor of media studies at University of Colorado Boulder. And I have the Media Enterprise Design Lab. And I love this topic. I'm really interested in that challenge of progress. I think it's deeply important for us to be reinventing the democratic project in certain respects. And that's, for instance, something that I'm involved in along with Divya and others who are probably here in the Meta Governance Project. But at the same time, I think it's deeply important to look to the past and understand our relationship to the past. So a lot of my work, for instance, in the DAO universe has been informed by my work with cooperatives and historical work there. And, for instance, I'm now working on a project with political scientist Federica Carugati on this idea of governance archaeology, which is about how do we relate to the past when designing the tools of the future? What kinds of responsibility, obligation, relationship do we have with people we might be learning from, whether they remain on this earth or not? So this question of progress is really, it's really powerful to me. I'm glad we have the chance to talk about it.
Super. Thanks, everybody. I'm excited to talk about it too. I'll do a little bit of setup here, and then I would like to sort of step back and do as little traffic directing as possible. I think it's great if we can just kind of this is a meaty topic, and so it'd be great if we can just sort of respond to another and do this informally. But just to sort of get things started, here's let me set up a bit of a distinction. So we have this sort of commonplace idea of technological progress. We all kind of think what we know what is meant when we say that or hear that. In parallel, there's another sort of idea of progress, which occasionally crops up, which is the idea of moral progress. One of my favorite thinkers who I constantly return to, John Dewey, is very interested in the idea of moral progress. John Dewey is, to be clear, is the American pragmatist philosopher from the early part of the 20th century. He has an idea of moral progress. He thinks that that it is possible for us to sort of evolve and grow morally through sort of engagement in public life, through engagement, across lines of diversity and engagement with the world around us. In many ways, I'm attracted to this notion, and in other ways, I think the idea of moral progress can in some, in the wrong hands, it can slip into sort of a funny idea. Then finally, there's this idea of sort of progress in governance. Like, is governance actually something that we can get better at? And if we did, what would that mean? The notion of progress in governance that I've been sort of toying with in the sort of the background of my work with RadicalxChange for a while is the idea that there is this thing that governance tries to do, which is to help us get better at forming shared goals. And that sort of, that is an extremely imperfect sort of formulation, but that does seem like something that we might be able to get better at to me. You can ask further questions about the quality of those shared goals, but it does seem like we might be able to get better through governance systems, through kind of, improved institutions of democracy or markets that work better or something like that. We might be able to get better at rowing in the same direction, or being committed to the same kinds of, being committed to common ideals, learning from one another, sort of refining our ideals towards something in common and working towards it. So why don't I stop there? I'm really curious if this sort of tripartite distinction sparks anything for any of you, and would love to get your thoughts. I know you all think about this stuff a lot. Oh, Deepti, I think you're muted.
No, I was just calling on Nathan or Divya to break the silence. I guess I would just start by agreeing with you, Matt, that we can make progress in governance, that our ability as humans to get better at being humans together, to make better, set those shared goals, work on them together, and deal with the conflict that comes up as we work on them together is a possibility. I think the question to me is, what are the structures, the conditions of success that we need to put into place in order to facilitate that process for people? and you know, I don't have a clear answer to that. And you know, New Public and what we're working on is really thinking about what the design of these digital spaces are where people are coming together. Our research a couple years ago, we call it the signals, when we surveyed about 20,000 people, asking them kind of what led to a healthy digital space for them, was that these spaces need to, the four main characteristics, what we call the building blocks, that they need to be welcoming, they need to foster connection, they need to foster understanding, and then they need to enable action. And so, you know, and I know Nathan and Divya have been exploring this in other ways too, but I think it's like a really worthy question to be pursuing and iterating on in the same way that we iterate, you know, on the technologies it is that surround us.
I love how that report, that Civic Signals report, puts the digital spaces in conversation, and so much of New Public's work, like, puts the digital spaces in conversation with previous kinds of spaces that we've been experiencing in civic life, and in some ways calling attention to the maybe lack of progress, the way in which there were things that we knew about making digital space that we have allowed ourselves to forget in making digital spaces. You know, an example of that I keep thinking about is and I've written some about, is my mother's garden club, which has this like really nice little, you know, booklet of its bylaws. And I, you know, remember having these conversations with her while I was struggling with an online community and a conflict I didn't know how to resolve. And just, and she was talking about the politics of her garden club. And I was realizing, wow, you have a much more sophisticated governance structure than any online space I've been in. And these bylaws are just very rudiment, you know, very basic, typical bylaws of a local civic organization. And yet there was a kind of sophistication there that it seemed to me, you know, we hadn't met, and that struck me as an opportunity. Wow, what can we do with that? And I think that, you know, the urgency of this challenge of progress is so important. I think in the kind of larger geopolitical moment, where, you know, one way of telling the story of where we are and the rise of authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism, I think has to do with the sense that people feel the systems they live in are no longer accountable to what they expect of those systems, right? And, you know, I don't know if it's a progress question. You know, maybe it's a matter of broadening our repertoire of what's been done in the past. And I keep thinking of, you know, this space in the Library of Congress in Washington, where, you know, the Thomas Jefferson's library that he donated to the Library of Congress is located in this kind of spiral shape, and it's a very, you know, it's a powerful piece for this question, because that library is full of like classical literature, right? It's full of like ancient Greeks and Romans that he was looking at when designing the systems that would become, you know, the kind of Republican government. And so there was this bounce back to the past at a moment where new social contracts were being written, this turn to the past. There's also drawing on indigenous practices that people in the Americas were seeing around them in really, really powerful ways, and in ways that they were not giving credit to. And that, of course, they were developing a government that was designed to colonize. And so, you know, that you know, bookshelf, I think, casts real questions on that possibility of progress. There is a sense in which there was progress being made there in the development of a Republican government that could function and stand the test of time in the modern world. But at the same time, it involved this going back, this looking back, this selective looking back, and it involved this kind of primitive accumulation, this new colonialism of the very, you know, the very peoples who were informing that so-called progress. So it you know, that bookshelf casts some really interesting, and challenging questions on the idea of progress. And I think it invites us to, be very, very careful about any self-assurance that we are in fact progressing.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really interesting point, which is that progress kind of assumes a point of view, I think. I mean, where from what point of view is progress being made, and it assumes a way to understand and measure that progress. I think even with something like technological progress, which maybe we may think of as somewhat self-evident of the types of progress, we still, what counts as progress depends on how we measure it. For example, I've done some work on AI governance, and a lot of that was around, can we measure augmentation instead of replacement of humans, right? And it changes the way we think about what types of systems count as progress. If we're trying to say, well, does a system make a person's life better, and that's our measure of progress, as opposed to, does this speak like a human, and that's our measure of progress. And so I think even for the types of progress that we may think of as, more linear, perhaps, it's not really the case. There is kind of an assumption of a point of view. And therefore, I think both to Nathan and Deepti's point, perhaps we can, I haven't thought about this idea before, so I'm just going to say it. Perhaps we can, instead of governance progress being a third type in the original typology with technology and moral progress, perhaps governance is the process through which we can measure or understand what progress means to people, right? And I think even the Civic Signals Project, for example, to me, is that governance progress, or is that us understanding what technological change should look like, and therefore the better shared goals are kind of giving us that standpoint for the other types of progress, as opposed to kind of their own track of progress forward.
That's a really interesting idea, thinking about governance as a way of understanding what the standpoint is with respect to the other two. And it makes me think about a lot of things. And I'm also thinking, it may make sense, another kind of thread to tease out here might be the opposite of progress. Like, how do we lose things, right? So there's all these, there's incredible store of wisdom from the past about how to do governance, which might mean, how to understand the standpoint of others. And yet we somehow seem, in various ways, we somehow seem to keep losing it, right? Like there's always been, it gets lost in colonial projects, and gets lost in the Middle Ages, and then it gets lost when we like set up DAOs that don't do what the Garden Club does, right? So is there like a common theme here? Like, how do we keep losing stuff?
I think one of the I've been focused a lot on this story of how we lost some progress maybe in the digital turn. And it's around this concept I call implicit feudalism, which is basically like, why is it that all of our online spaces are based on this like weird idea of someone having eternal admin rights who started the space, whether it's a Facebook group or an email list or everything, they all work that way. And as a result, things like elections or due process or things that you would expect in civic spaces elsewhere are just completely missing, at least in the technical infrastructure for online community space. And I think there's this, on the one hand, there is this sense that, this occurred really in the development of the first online spaces, and it had to do with kind of accidental technical features, like these were computers sitting in somebody's house. There were questions about what the legality is, who's legally responsible for something posted on a BBS. Well, maybe it's me because it's in my house, so maybe I should have ultimate responsibility. There are all these like little choices that ended up, I think, having really big consequences at a time, and those choices were made at a time when the stakes were low. And then the technology comes and spreads, and we have this sense of sufficiency, this sense of awe that this technology is allowing us to do all these new things we couldn't do before. And because of that awe, that kind of splendor of the ability to like follow your grandparents on Facebook, we forget, oh, there's something missing. There's something that we didn't pick up in developing these systems. There's something we didn't learn from our previous civic spaces in building the current ones. And so I think that, and this is so important in that DAO moment, right, where there is a lot of shiny new technology and there are a lot of promises being made. And it's precisely in those moments of kind of deer in headlights when I think we are at tremendous risk for forgetting.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me is a little bit about what Divya said earlier. Like, what counts as progress? How do we measure it? Certainly matters. But who's at the table to get to determine that? And in Nathan's example of, somebody in their garage with their computer, then innovating, Y over X, the experience of that somebody matters a lot in how it has then manifested in what we're experiencing in the Facebook groups it is that we're a part of. And so I think that, Matt, as we think about like why do we keep tripping? And I'm not sure we've really reckoned with power and our discomfort with the distribution of it. And we're really interested in figuring out how you can like really turn that on its head. So we're right now trying to design some tools and spaces for caregivers around schools to be in better connection with one another. But what does it really mean to be designing from the perspective of Jason, the after-school teacher who's working 3 jobs and who is likely the most proximate to the real challenges that the parents and communities around the school are facing, or the grandmother who is now the official guardian of her 4th grader and all the challenges it is that she has in that role. And being able to turn the table around who is at the table for designing these innovations seems like, back to Divya's point, a way that we also begin to address governance progress too.
Yeah, I mean, this brings up another interesting question, which is this sort of question of like governance design. So there's a couple parts to it for me. One part is like, so it's occurred to me that sort of, in a way, I think that the web 2 was very much about like user experience design, where maybe maybe the sort of corollary to that in web 3 is governance design, right? So in other words, and that holds some interesting warnings to me, because the idea of designing for users, I think didn't do what it wanted to do, right? It ended up sort of smoothing out the pathway for users to get like exploited within contexts that they didn't fully understand. And so when we think about governance design, we want to not make the same mistake, right? We want to not like hard to articulate exactly how to do that. I mean, this would be sort of a long conversation about what the corollary there is, but I think that part of the answer might be like more involvement of people in the design process itself, right? As opposed to thinking about like like if I take my perspective and try to think about what somebody else's needs are and try to build that into governance, I'm probably not going to do that good of a job, right? So we need kind of everybody to be involved. But then there's these interesting questions for me about how that relates to past experience. So when we think about older forms of governance, a lot of them are not completely, but in large part sort of like received from tradition. So if I'm born into some tradition that like whether it's like an indigenous culture or like a democratic republic, there's a governance tradition there that I'm plugging into. I'm kind of adopting it, but I also didn't really design it, right? It was received from history in a way. So anyway, there's a lot there, but what do you, curious if any of you have thoughts about this process of design, of involving people in the design of governance institutions themselves?
Yeah, I have thoughts on user experience design and sort of like human-centered design broadly, which I think really took over as a central quasi-ideology for a time in terms of what it would mean to build technology well, and design thinking and all of these sorts of things. And I did some work in India, for example, for a few years. And adjacent to the kind of work I was doing, there was a huge amount of like technology for development, TM type of work. And I think a lot of that work really centered around the concept of human experience design, but for development. Like, how do you go somewhere, need find, and then solve a problem, and then produce a technology? And now looking back, we've seen the failures of so many of those models. And I think the question is sort of deeper than people, the user experience being so good that people ended up doing things they didn't want to do. I think the problem really is one of incentive structures and one of how people are viewed in that process. Like, are they viewed as having, continuous agency and information and preferences and values throughout the process? Or are those things we sort of determine a priori and then solve for? And I think the solving for preferences model within the incentive structures of growth and profit were the problem at quite a deep level. And if we take those same types of points of view to governance, which we very well might, in the sense of governance is the process of solving for collective preferences, and also we'd like it to be done in a way that can grow and scale and possibly make profit, depending on how you construe Web3, then I think governance becomes essentially equivalent to something like what human design, or human-centered design, or user experience design has ended up being. And that's concerning to me. And so I think that, well, what do you do about that, right? I mean, I think it's great to say we should change all the incentive structures. Obviously, I assume we'd all like to do that. But it's a question of where to begin in that process, I think. And then for me, and I'm excited to hear everyone's thoughts on kind of what the past can tell us about this. But for me, some of that comes from recognizing how much we lose when we don't take into account what people are capable of throughout the entire process. And that's something that you can make a normative argument for, but I think you can also make a pretty good efficacy argument for the fact that you lose a huge amount of input and capacity and just ability and progress perhaps in a system if you are using a couple of people's capabilities instead of everyone's capabilities. And I think many of the systems that we've seen succeed or are interesting, even on the Web3 side, are the ones that are able to take advantage of that collective intelligence. And to me, collective intelligence as a concept is therefore quite opposite from user-centered design or user experience design or whatever, even though I think design thinking has conflated those two types of concepts quite severely.
Yeah, I mean, preach, Divya. For us, it's really been a shift. And as some of you know, I was at Facebook for a really long time, where user-centered design is really on like what guides a lot of our product decisions. And the shift for us is really as we think about governance, and also as we think about these outcomes of cohesion and plurality, they are by definition about different kinds of people coming together. So human-centered design may work if you're optimizing for one individual, a human, but as we think about optimizing for collective and community and democracy, it seems as though we do need to radically change our design approach from a human-centered design lens to that of a community-centered design lens, which then by definition brings into conversation some of these issues around power and inequity and how we want to navigate that. And so And then as we learned a few Saturdays ago, as we were thinking about tools to create for caregiving communities around schools, it needs to feel really different. Like it needs to we need to meet people where they're at. And what does that mean for all the jargon it is that we're using? And yeah, just again, back to the conditions of success so that everybody feels their place and ability to contribute. And again, not only at the beginning, as Divya is saying, but throughout the process.
Yeah, Sasha Costanza-Chock in her book Design Justice really stresses accountability, right? Beyond just inclusion, but how do you create structures of accountability? And I think it's so important to recognize in both of these regimes, there have been like actually structural barriers outside of the technology that have prevented that kind of community-centered design you're talking about, and have prevented kind of governance practices, and have enabled these kinds of inversions of earlier ambitions. One example, and I think, Matt, you're really right that there is this turn from the user experience regime to the governance regime. And that reveals, I think, the kind of opportunity we're in. For instance, an early case of social media was this kind of storied crisis in this community called Lambda Mu, where there was a virtual sexual assault. And in response to this, there was this development of a kind of democratic proposal process where users would be able to decide on policies. But this was running out of Xerox PARC, a lab in California, and the engineers running the experiment were like, wait a second, again, like we're legally responsible for what's going on. So actually we are going to assume the power, right? So it was actually the external legal environment that made it so that governance was really not something you could do. And then it was the external legal environment that brings in VC capital and accelerates, sets the financial objectives of those online spaces. In the Web3 world, there is actually an opportunity to turn away from that, that paradigm to have a kind of governance, a space where there is real collective accountability, because there doesn't necessarily have to be a Xerox PARC where the server is sitting, where your smart contracts are being run, where your token is operating. No, it's on a distributed ledger. And so there is actually this opportunity for governance. But once again, we're seeing external forces shaping what that governance actually looks like. Like, again, large VCs coming in and taking majority control of DAOs and other systems. And so I think this calls on us to think not just about the technical systems, not just about the user experience, though that's very important. And there are some really cool experiments that are going on, but to ask, how can we structure how people enter this economy? What kinds of constraints do we need to put on? What kinds of enablers do we need to put on to enable community ownership to be real and that community accountability to be real? Do we need to create, public policy that shifts who has access to the crypto economy? Do we need to ban certain kinds of actors in this economy so that, smaller players are able to have a say? So last time around, I think we missed the opportunity of the technology because we failed to notice the external powers that would prey on it and that would be able to exploit it. And I think we're very, very much in danger of doing that again. And the stakes are higher because now governance is actually in play in a new kind of way.
Yeah, I know Nathan and I have both been thinking about this, but I think this is what highlights subsidiarity as absolutely necessary in this context, because we are, in my view, in sort of an open window of being able to structure some of the underlying layers of how the rest of this ecosystem develops. And that is already being massively influenced, as we've discussed, by people in entrenched positions of power of various kinds. And the gradient is in that direction. Like, it's always likely that it will continue in that direction. But I think there's an open window to say, can we put in primitives of subsidiarity, and subsidiarity being something like local control agency, scale through federation, et cetera. Can we put in those principles in an architectural and a socio-architectural way, more importantly, early enough that you can divert the gradient? Because, realistically, I think sometimes often the most you can do is divert the gradient. It's not possible to build entire new systems from scratch. In fact, that is the fundamental truth of governance. It's not even something that we may necessarily want. And so what are the specific design principles we can bring in early that divert that gradient towards the collective accountability, collective intelligence world that we might want to see? And perhaps some of that is structures for subsidiarity, whether that means public policy constraints on size of various kinds. Perhaps that means certain percentages of ownership are what is referred to as decentralized and is regulated in a different way with certain benefits. There are lots of different particular proposals for doing that. But to me, I think that's why this open window is so important and can give us the governance directional gradient that we might prefer to see.
I think it might be useful to take a minute to define the idea of subsidiarity and lay it on the table, because it's very Divya, I know you just wrote something about it in Wired, and it's a very old and interesting sort of pattern in governance that seems to not be getting outdated. And yeah, I think it's useful might be useful to lay it out.
It's so beautiful to see that term show up in Wired and with Divya's pen and her co-authors, because it's so old and something, as someone who's very influenced by Catholic social teaching, it's something that has been is this weird unwieldy word that is always in the back of my mind, and so it's been thrilling to see. But it's a term about, as Divya said, local control as much as possible, local autonomy about things that matter to the community, context sensitive power structures. But it's not just about that. It's also about building systems of scale. So it's about how do you build large systems that involve that local control, and what is the relationship between the larger and the smaller? And to look at it historically, it kind of arose in two concurrent traditions in Europe. One was Calvinist legal thought, which was involved which involved local communities that were essentially autonomous. This was the Congregationalist logic of the Puritans, who then colonized, the America, the New England and so forth, where each church was functionally autonomous, but they were networked and they were talking to each other and they were kind of holding each other accountable in a networked structure. And then the term also shows up in Catholic context, where it's much more of a hierarchical logic, much more of that kind of hierarchical federation. So there are different ways of thinking about how that local context-aware community might relate to the larger system. But I've been working on this with my colleague, Amy Hassanoff. We've been contrasting this with the logic of scalability in online platforms, which is a logic in which the assumption is that we can scale without changing the rules of the system. So we can have a universal rule book for all communities, even if we spread all over the world. And that's what we really hold in contrast with subsidiarity, that context sensitive, that insistence that there is space for appropriate governance and powerful governance at the local scale, rather than the assumption that is driven by the VC logic that you can grow at as close to zero marginal cost. So it does this challenge and this demand for subsidiary structures. We've been focused especially on responses to harm, looking at, for example, transformative and restorative justice practices. What would it take to enable those kinds of local control to occur as responses to harm? Well, it would really challenge the fundamental business models of so much of the online economy, which are, again, reliant on this idea of scaling without cost, scaling without enabling, that local control, adding more and more communities without really having to pay for their autonomy. So it's an old concept. It doesn't run against the idea of scale, but it does challenge how the online economy has been scaled.
I also want to thanks, Nathan, for that was a great sort of summary of subsidiarity. And one more thing I want to throw out about subsidiarity is that tip of the cap to Professor Daniel Halberstam of University of Michigan Law School, who's one of the best teachers I had in law school and is a scholar of EU law. The European Union is, despite its problems, is a really interesting instance of building a power structure, maybe democratic power structure that kind of interpenetrates other existing power structures, right? And managed in some way to do something that is at least partially successful. And one of the basic principles in European Union constitutionalism is the principle of subsidiarity. So when the European Union makes directives and regulations and things like that, one of the sort of criteria that these things have to adhere to is this principle of subsidiarity. I think that despite the European Union's quite real challenges, this guiding philosophy might be one of the, I think has something to do with the ways in which it's successful. Yeah, anyway, just wanted to throw that out there as another kind of avenue to consider this principle. I wanted to pick up one earlier thread, which is this idea of Deepti, what you were sort of getting at before, about sort of what it should feel like, or like what we might want it to feel like to participate in governance in the context of communities and stuff. And draw that together with something Nathan was saying earlier about sort of shiny new technology. I think there's something important here, which is that like one thing that I've kind of a word that I've been toying with is the idea of like mesmerization. There's something about new technologies that is mesmerizing, shiny new things, and the shiny new things have an interesting consequence of diverting our attention, sort of hijacking our attention, and making us, I think, not diverting attention that might otherwise be sort of paying attention to the context of power or something. And I think that I don't know exactly what I mean by this. I mean, this is very much thinking in public here, but I have this kind of an intuition that the way that we want governance, the way we want participation in governance to feel is often not this shiny, mesmerizing thing, right? I think that it's often actually, like when governance is working well, it often feels like a bad product. It feels frictional. It feels difficult. It feels burdensome. It requires you to like stop what you're doing and think and negotiate and stuff. And I wonder if does that make sense? Do you guys agree with that? Do you think there's something there? And if so, how do we incorporate that with the process of like governance design? How do we make sense of that?
I think we can separate some, I think you said the words like frictional, difficult, stop and think. And I think those can all be separate types of concepts, in the sense that, as per our conversation about user experience design earlier, do we want the process of governance to be like you log into an app in the morning and you never talk to anyone about it, and you pick between like 8 colors for the day, and then the app assumes all of your other preferences based on like this really easy decision that you made. I mean, obviously not, right? But Oscar Wilde has this quote where it's about socialism. He says something like, "I love socialism, but it would take too many evenings." And you know, I think that that's not the energy we want, basically. Like I think that it doesn't have to be difficult to do governance, but I think it does have to be frictional, in the sense that frictionlessness is definitely not what we're aiming for. And to me, frictionlessness is sort of that space of things of concepts that we're staying away from. But I've spoken to a lot of people who had their first, maybe quote unquote, governance experiences as parts of DAOs, and they found it incredibly wonderful. And they were so excited about voting on Snapshot and got excited every time they could vote on anything on Snapshot, which I thought was very sweet. And, you know, I think things like this do happen. I, at one point, lived in like a 50-person co-op, and we made all of our decisions on consensus, which is insane. I mean, and we did have several very silly conversations, you know, multiple hours on whether we should buy a blender or things like this, what song to play at some point of the day. But mostly this was a process that people really loved, and people showed up to meetings and, you know, were able to co-construct a shared space because there was a frictional but, you know, collectively involved governance process. And to me, that's something that I would like governance to feel like. And I think governance has a leg up on this, maybe. Like, I think governance can and does maybe in some form already feel that way. And so it's about bringing the ways that governance has often felt for people in terms of being held in community and having agency and these things that people like, and I can say that I like, and bringing that into digital space without having to pair it with the logic of frictionlessness, which I do think, to your point, can, you know, sap away at what's good about governance. And in some ways, if you have frictionless governance, you're not getting that sense of, you know, agency and being held in community that you may otherwise want.
Yeah, the word that really comes to mind, even as Divya talks about her co-op experience, is joy. Like, there is joy in this work that's done together. And how do we bring that joy forward as a part of what it is that we design? Because the joy is sticky, and the joy makes you want to do it again and again and again. And, you know, when you say happy birthday to somebody on Messenger, like the balloons or whatever, the confetti, like, you know, blows up on your phone. And we're really thinking about kind of, how do you not design broccoli-like civic tech products, but really joyful, sexy, colorful, like all the things it is that are happening in Divya's co-op or in Nathan's mom's garden meetings. Really, how do you bring that feel to this process of decision making together and grappling through hard stuff? And it's possible to then make the friction feel worthwhile, like more sustainable.
There's also something very briefly about building, you know, the practice of participation, socializing politics, you know, these sorts of things, where maybe I do think there's a way in which we broadly are out of practice with active participation. And that obviously makes it very hard, because it's difficult to do things you're out of practice with. It's unfamiliar. It is challenging. It's annoying. If your practice of participation is very much like getting a million fundraising emails from politicians and having, you know, going to vote, like, that's rough, you know. Of course, it doesn't engender these feelings. And I imagine, you know, that doesn't have to be what participation feels like. And I think, to Deepti's point, that's not often what participation in the things that we do regularly participate in and make decisions about and try to create shared agency over, it doesn't feel that way. So I think part of the goal is just to increase that practice of participation. And that's why some of the Web3 concepts are very exciting to me, because I think they give people the chance to practice active participation, which can then balloon and grow into so many other different things. And it doesn't matter to me very much where people's practice of participation starts. I think it's just building that practice and ritual of understanding what it could look like to have agency over space.
I love those concepts, joy, practice are so critical. I mean, I've had experiences with DAO people saying like, oh no, we're only getting like 1% participation. What do co-ops do about this? And I'm like, first of all, this is an old problem. And second of all, this is why at the annual meeting of Colorado Electric Co-ops, someone in a robot suit shows up and there's food, and there are those draws that are more than just come vote at the annual meeting. And DAOs have their memes, and they're experimenting with ways to try to draw people in and to figure out what does actually make sense to draw people into and what doesn't. And another word I'll just throw in it is play. The governance as game, is so much a part of what an electoral system looks like. There are different sides, for better or worse, often. Maybe we need a different kind of game that isn't just 2 players or multiple players, but is a different kind of goal, maybe something that looks more like a cooperative game. But that sense of calling on that human practice of play as part of the process, I think is another way to bring that joy in, to recognize that, like any other kind of game, practice is important, and the more you do it, the better you get.
This also relates to something that Audrey Tong has talked about in the concept of in connection with like digital democracy in Taiwan, is the use of humor, right? The Taiwanese government, in encouraging participation in its participatory systems, hires comedians, right? Which is sort of I think there's an interesting conversation to have about how to do that, well, how to create the right sorts of memes and robot suits and humor to sweeten the broccoli, without there's also ways that, I don't know, there's an interesting balance to sort of strike here that I think I'm not exactly sure what the heuristic is yet.
An age-old community organizing principle is you meet people where they're at. And I think that if we were just able to do that simple thing, it's like really get into dialogue and conversation with people and meet them where they're at, we will end up in these more joyful, playful, humorous places. And from there, we have the opportunity to build what will be sustaining and what will be positive. And I think it's upon all of us, and particularly people like us, to really figure out what it takes to really move away from the jargon and move away from the systems and move away from, what was your word, magnetic, mesmerizing technologies, to just the daily lives of people, and building from starting our design and building process from there.
And it raises that question you both raised earlier about standpoint and meet who where they're at. A meme drenched Discord, is meeting some kinds of people where they're at, but not others. And that intentionality about who is immediately raised by what you just said.
I'll bring in a question from the Slido, which is talking governance and its distinction to usership. If platformization is highly centralized usership governance, how would the distinction between usership and governance change in decentralized technology? So if I understand the question correctly, yeah, Divya, you're nodding, so.
Well, I felt like I understood the question.
I think the user is or I think the questioner is asking how does, given in Web3, since we don't have centralized platforms, does that change the distinction between the user and the participant in governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a great distinction, right? On one hand, we were talking about this dichotomy between user design and governance design, and on the other, there's centralized and decentralized, which I think are, you could have any combination of those two things, in my opinion. Like, you can have pretty decentralized systems that are very user design focused or governance design focused. But I do think that, and I think Nathan made this point earlier, there is something to be said for a removal of some of the structural reasons why platforms became so centralized in the first place. It's not necessarily true that that will be replaced with something that is, functionally or decentralized in the ways that we've been talking about, but that's the open window, which is that the reasons that some of the platforms we have are so centralized in their governance may be eroded by some of the realities of decentralized architecture. And it's a question of what sort of fills that gap. And there's a potential that what will fill that gap is really interesting governance innovations, things like delegation and liquid democracy and overlaps of community governance and mutual aid systems and all of these kinds of things. It's possible that, and we've already seen this with a lot of, DAOs that have tried to do liquid democracy type delegation things, is that the same types of people in the community or other centers of power like VC firms are the ones that end up also sort of winning at that game. So I think it's a question of what direction we go, but the removal of some of those constraints is an open window.
I think also, yeah, the work you've done around identity and how we register persons, is so crucial to this question. Do we create designs that have a robust sense of personhood, that have a very thin sense of personhood, that have no sense of personhood? These raise important questions about, are we going to keep talking about users, or are we going to talk about persons or other kinds of terms? Who are we even imagining? There's been so much critique of the very concept of the user. In my work, I tend to kind of adopt it and say, okay, if the platforms are going to treat us as users, let's step up as users. Let's organize as users. But but we have an opportunity, especially if we're talking about power, about reorienting how we track identity, how we know identity, what kind of power people have over their own identities, their ability to assert who they are in these experiences, is at stake as well.
So another sort of question that I've been working through has to do with the context in which governance can happen. So in other words, I think a lot of times people in sort of new institutions, the thing being governed is essentially like a resource or like a speculative enterprise that people are trying to get something out of. So in other words, this is the case with corporate governance often, right? Or it can be the case with governance of some crypto asset or something. And I wonder whether you guys have thoughts about whether governance in that kind of a situation is fundamentally different from governance in, from some other sort of a more traditionally public or social type of governance. And what I have in mind when I ask this question is, Deepti, when you were talking about sort of this idea of meeting people where they're at in governance processes, I totally agree with that. I think that feels right to me. That feels like a guiding light in terms of how to think about this stuff. But when we're trying to cooperate through a governance system for some instrumental purpose, that seems harder, right? Like if I'm a shareholder in a public corporation and I'm participating with Carl Icahn, like in the governance process, like he actually does not need me to meet him where he's at, right? So I just wonder where how you think about, is this something you've thought about? Have you thought about this kind of contextual distinction in how governance should feel?
I think this is where we have a lot more to learn, but where one of the things like the financialization of Web3 is of great concern, I think, to all of us. And, introducing the instrument of money definitely changes the quality of a conversation around governance. And, I'm curious to hear from Divya and Nathan, particularly as we look at co-ops and what were the, conditions of success that allowed for conversations around money in particular to be done in really healthy ways. But I think this is for me personally, this is the largest caution about the territory we're stepping into. And I've played around a lot with this idea of the community entrepreneur, the individual it is who takes upon the responsibility to build community. But the thing it is that always trips me up about the combination of those two words is the juxtaposition of entrepreneur and community. And this has been a question I've wrestled with for a really long time and believe I will only continue to. And so, no, don't have an answer, but I'm very curious about learning here. And yeah, Nathan, Divya, really curious to hear your points of view also.
Yeah, this may be just quite pragmatic and not philosophical, but I think that there is something to be said for meeting all entities where they're at, including corporations and the government and et cetera, in the sense that what we need to do most likely to improve governance outcomes, but also material outcomes for people, is work through the institutions that we have, change them and make them obsolete if possible, right? And on that, I think that it's necessary to take something like publicly governed companies and think about how they fit into the structure, because they're a massive part of how the domestic and global economy is and how people interact with it and what their lives look like. And so, there are multiple avenues to do that, right? One is making an efficacy case for good governance. I think this is possible to do in a lot of spaces, and it's possible to do in technology. And for example, large platforms are really struggling with things that would work better, I think we agree, at a subsidiarity level rather than at the type of scalability that they've chosen. This is bad for all of us, but it's also bad for those companies. And so can you make that argument? Perhaps, perhaps not. Maybe it's about working on the regulatory side and thinking about how do you structure from the outside that market such that it goes towards these types of values. And that's something I also believe in. Maybe it's about working on the grassroots, can we build a parallel ecosystem side? And that's some of, I think, what we've been talking about. And I think that's absolutely crucial work as well. But it is my opinion that none of these and many other kind of approaches besides will work on their own. And so, I think that it is important to think about meeting the world as a whole where it's at and kind of pushing on the points of it that it's possible for each of us to push on in terms of getting to these types of futures and being pragmatic about it, whenever possible, in the most prefigurative sense that it can be done.
The design justice book that I mentioned earlier that Sasha Costanza-Chock, challenges that possibility in I think a very powerful way of, and I'm not sure if this is what you're saying, but of trying to do something for instance, questions the possibility of universal design. Can you design for everybody? And argues that we live in a world of inequalities, and to design for everybody generally means to design for a kind of status quo, for a kind of replication of systems, and challenges designers to say, no, you're making a choice one way or another. Be intentional about your choices. And I think one can be intentional about choices, about how you relate to governments and corporations and so forth. But I think that the recognition of that choice is really important. And to me, it does go back to that community entrepreneur concept, which I don't think is a contradiction. I think it's very real. And, in co-op development, I really encourage founders, to hold their leadership, to know that leadership is important, even in co-ops, and great co-ops don't happen without it. And in the same way that labor organizers look for those organic leaders in a workplace, and that build their strategy around, not them telling everybody what to do, but helping to empower the people who have that respect and that capacity to lead. And I think the challenge is, right now entrepreneurs are trained around a very particular set of power relationships, around their relationships to investors, to a certain business model, to their exit. And I think that one of the challenges that we face right now is how can we support that creative leadership in a way that is differently accountable, and that allows leaders to make those choices differently about how they are relating to these different poles of power, so that, as Divya suggests, we can make some of these, these current structures obsolete. But I think it does require leadership. I think it does require a kind of intentionality in relationship to structures of power.
So I know we've got to wrap up a little bit early today, but maybe I'll just give you all the opportunity to share some closing thoughts, and before we jump off.
Well, I'll just say thank you to all of you for being part of this conversation. It's a great way to start a Friday morning for sure. You all probably noticed, I don't know, the pages of notes it is that I was scribbling, and I really appreciate to be in conversation and creative conversation about what it is that we need to be doing together. I guess maybe I'll just end where we started and where Nathan really ended us, is that what's most alive for me at the end of this conversation, it is, again, the leadership and the humans that are required to kind of like step up to frame what is good, and then like push on all the existing power structures in order for us to really get there. And that also is only going to happen through community, and the more it is that we're all able to work together. And so I really, I hope that we can do more, Nathan, to support this creative leadership that is going to be required to make this kind of more plural future possible.
Thank you so much. Such a good conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to just be in dialogue, to have such good thinkers and heart, honestly, values at the center of the various projects that we're representing and that we're bringing together here. So thank you all. Thank you, Matt, for bringing us together.
Yeah, to echo that, I mean, this has been really wonderful, and I feel very lucky to be a part of what feels like an increasingly sort of vibrant and growing and meaningful space in which these conversations are not only happening, but organizations are building experiments and thinking about these things and interacting and sort of sharing a core of the types of values we've been discussing, right? Local control and governance and agency and joy and play. And it feels like there is momentum around these ideas, and it's not just us, it's whoever is listening, it's the many other events like this that are happening every week. And that growth gives me a lot of hope, as do all of you. So I feel very grateful for that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a privilege to be able to talk and work with you all as well. And I'm really, I think what's coming out of this for me is just I'm inspired by the opportunity to kind of think about governance as a way of sort of like a lens to see other people, right, and connect with other people. And I think that it's important to sort of to keep that in mind as we try to remain oriented towards a North Star in this emerging space. And yeah, thanks for taking the time to do a little bit of thinking and philosophizing on a Friday morning. I think it's important to do this, and I'm super happy to be able to do it with you.
Awesome. Bye, everybody.